Hey guys, welcome to BudgetEDH. I'm your host Mike, and on today's episode, we bring you Tuvasa the Sunlit at a $100 budget. Tuvasa is green, white, and blue for a legendary creature that gets +1/+1 for each enchantment you control. Whenever you cast your first enchantment spell each turn, draw a card. With the release of Theros Beyond Death, there are a lot of new cards that we can add to enchantment-based commanders, so I felt like it was a great time to put out a Tuvasa deck tech. Tuvasa has an enchantress ability on her that lets you draw a card whenever you play your first enchantment spell each turn, and we are going to put quite a few cards in the deck that allow us to draw cards whenever we play enchantments. Now, Tuvasa has an ability that pumps her up for each enchantment we control, and we are going to play this as a Voltron strategy, as we are going to put a lot of enchantments in our deck to pump Tuvasa up with different auras that we can attach to her. There's a lot of strong interaction in this deck because there's a lot of enchantments that deal with problematic permanents that your opponents may play. Since we are playing a Voltron strategy with auras, if our opponents are able to remove our Tuvasa, we can lose all those auras, so we need ways of getting those back from the graveyard, so there is quite a bit of enchantment recursion in this deck to get those auras back. And we did include a 2-card combo from one of our latest deck techs in this deck as well, which we'll go over later in the video, that gives us a way to win the game on the spot if we draw those 2 cards. Let's start out this deck tech by talking about some of the ramp that we included in this deck. Since Tuvasa only costs 3 mana to play her, we want to keep our ramp cheap so that we can possibly get our Tuvasa out early. So first up we have Llanowar Elves and Elvish Mystic. They both cost a green, and then they can tap to add a green to your mana pool. And then next up we have Arbor Elf. It's 1 green for a creature that you can tap to untap target forest. Arbor Elf has some synergies with enchant land cards that you can put onto a forest, and then you can untap it with Arbor Elf to get even more mana out of it. Next up we have a couple of enchant lands that are going to add extra mana whenever we tap our lands for mana. So first up we have Wild Growth. It's 1 green for an enchant land. Whenever enchanted land is tapped for mana, its controller adds an additional green. And then Utopia Sprawl is 1 green for an enchant forest. When it enters the battlefield, choose a color. Whenever enchanted forest is tapped for mana, its controller adds 1 mana of the chosen color to his or her mana pool. And then Fertile Ground is 1 and a green for an enchant land. Whenever enchanted land is tapped for mana, its controller adds an additional 1 mana of any color. All 3 of these work really well with Arbor Elf, as you can put these on a forest and get additional mana with your Arbor Elf on the battlefield to untap those forests. Next up, I want to talk about a couple of ways that we're able to reduce the casting cost of our enchantment spells to make them cheaper to cast. So first up, we have Starfield Mystic. It's 1 and a white for a creature. Enchantment spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Whenever an enchantment you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on Starfield Mystic. This not only reduces the casting cost of your enchantment spells, but it's also going to get bigger for each enchantment that gets put into your graveyard, making this a really great card to include in this deck. Next up we have Herald of the Pantheon. It's 1 and a green for a creature. Enchantment spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you gain 1 life. It is nice to get a little bit of life whenever you cast an enchantment spell, as well as having the reduction on this creature. Danitha Capation Paragon is 2 and a white for a legendary creature that has First Strike, Vigilance, and Lifelink. Aura and equipment spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. This is also a really great creature to put some auras on, as it does have a lot of keyword abilities, making it a very powerful creature to suit up with your auras. Next up, let's talk about all the ways that we're able to draw cards in this deck. Now, since we're playing a lot of enchantments in this deck, we are going to lean heavily on enchantresses, which are going to let us draw cards whenever we play an enchantment. And Tuvasa has this ability on her as well, although it only works for the first enchantment that you play each turn. First up, we have Setesian Champion. It's 2 and a green for a creature out of Theros Beyond Death. It has Constellation. Whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Setesian Champion and draw a card. Not only is this going to draw you a bunch of cards for each enchantment that you play, it's also going to grow for each enchantment as well, making this a great creature to put some auras on if your Tuvasa gets removed too many times and you're not able to play her. Next up we have Verduran Enchantress. It's 1 green for a creature. Whenever you play an enchantment spell, you may draw a card. And then Eidolon of Blossoms is a little bit different. It's 2 green for an enchantment creature that has Constellation. Whenever Eidolon of Blossoms or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. This is going to draw you a card when it enters the battlefield and whenever any enchantment enters the battlefield, giving you a card as soon as you play it. Next up, we have 3 cards that have the same ability on them, with Mesa Enchantress, Satyr Enchanter, and Enchantress's Presence. They all have the ability that whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you draw a card. And then next up we have Shram, Senior Edificer. It's 1 and a white for a legendary creature. Whenever you cast an aura, equipment, or vehicle spell, draw a card. And then Core Spirit Dancer is 1 and a white for a creature that gets +2/+2 for each aura attached to it, and whenever you cast an aura spell, you may draw a card. We want as many of these effects as we can to let us draw cards whenever we play enchantments, because we do have a lot of enchantments in our deck. We want to be able to keep churning through our deck and finding auras to put on our Tuvasa. And Core Spirit Dancer is also going to be a great creature to enchant as she gets bigger for each aura that you put on her. If your Tuvasa gets removed too many times and you can't replay her, this is a great creature to suit up with your auras. Next up, let's go over all the interaction that we put into this deck. This deck has a heavy emphasis on interaction. There's quite a bit of interaction in this deck that's going to allow us to deal with our opponent's permanents and also counter their spells, allowing us to get rid of blockers and also anything that's problematic that gets in our way. So first up, there's Swords to Plowshares. It's 1 white for an instant. Exile target creature, its controller gains life equal to its power. So next up we have Generous Gift and Beast Within. They're both instants that allow us to destroy a target permanent, and then the controller of that permanent puts a 3/3 creature onto the battlefield. Next up, there's a couple of counter spells that we put into this deck, and the first is Counterspell. It's blue for an instant to counter target spell. Arcane Denial is 1 and a blue for an instant. Counter target spell, its controller may draw up to 2 cards at the beginning of next turn's upkeep, and then you draw a card at the beginning of next turn's upkeep. Dovin's Veto is a white and a blue for an instant. This spell can't be countered and counter target non-creature spell. This is one of the better counter spells to come out the last few years. It's very powerful as your opponents can't counter this spell, and it will counter almost anything. Next up we have Negate. It's 1 and a blue for an instant to counter target non-creature spell. So next up we have several enchantment cards that allow us to deal with non-land permanents that our opponents play. So we have Oblivion Ring, Banishing Light, and Cast Out. When they enter the battlefield, they're going to exile target non-land permanent and opponent controls until they leave the battlefield. The nice thing about Cast Out is Cast Out has flash, and then it also has cycling, so you can play this at instant speed, and if you don't need this, you can actually cycle it away for a white and draw a new card. Then we have Kenris Transformation. It's 1 and a green for an enchant creature. When it enters the battlefield, you can draw a card. An enchanted creature loses all abilities and is an elk creature with base power and toughness 3/3. Darksteel Mutation is similar. It's 1 and a white for an enchant creature. Enchanted creature is an insect artifact creature with base power and toughness 0/1 and has indestructible and loses all other abilities, card types, and creature types. And then Imprisoned in the Moon is another similar card that's 2 and a blue for an enchantment aura. Enchant creature, land, or planeswalker. Enchanted permanent is a colorless land with tap, add a colorless to your mana pool, and loses all other card types and abilities. If you put these on an opposing commander, it's going to lose all their abilities and their commander's going to sit there and be an elk, an insect, or a land, which can make it tough to get that commander back unless you have a way of blinking it or killing it. Next up, let's go over all the auras that we include in this deck that we can suit up our Tuvasa and other creatures with. So first up we have Ethereal Armor. It's 1 white for an enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each enchantment you control and has first strike. This is one of the best auras that you can put in this deck, not only because of its low cost, but also because it pumps up your creature for every enchantment that you control. And we do have a lot of enchantments in this deck, so your creature's going to get pretty big. And then another really powerful 1-drop aura is Rancor. It's 1 green for an enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +2/+0 and has trample. When Rancor is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return Rancor to its owner's hand. This is a great card. Not only does it give your creature trample, but it also returns itself to your hand whenever it goes to the graveyard, making this a very nice repeatable aura that you can put into your deck. Aqueous Form is 1 blue for an enchant creature. Enchanted creature can't be blocked, and whenever enchanted creature attacks, you can scry 1. This is great because it does give Tuvasa some evasion and make it unblockable so it can get in for that commander damage. Next up, we have a powerful one out of Throne of Eldraine, and it's All That Glitters. It's 1 and a white for an enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact and or enchantment you control. The nice thing about this is it pumps up for both artifacts and enchantments. And then Staggering Insight's another new one out of Theros Beyond Death. It's a white and a blue for an enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has lifelink, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. Those are 2 really great abilities on this card that only cost 2 mana. This is a really powerful aura to include in your deck. And then Eel Umbra is 1 and a blue for an enchant creature with flash. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1, and then the really important part of this card is Totem Armor. If enchanted creature would be destroyed, instead remove all damage from it and destroy this aura. This is a really nice way of protecting your creature with Totem Armor. Next up, we have Ancestral Mask. It's 2 and a green for an enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +2/+2 for each other enchantment on the battlefield. If you have this card on Tuvasa, Tuvasa's going to get real big real quick with Ancestral Mask. Next up, we have Steel the Godhead. It's 2 and a hybrid blue-white for an enchant creature. As long as enchanted creature is white, it gets +1/+1 and has lifelink. As long as enchanted creature is blue, it gets +1/+1 and unblockable. This is a great card because if you put this on Tuvasa, it's going to get both abilities. Having unblockable and lifelink is really powerful. And then Shield of the Oversoul is a similar one. It's 2 and a hybrid green-white for an enchant creature. As long as enchanted creature is green, it gets +1/+1 and indestructible. And as long as enchanted creature is white, it gets +1/+1 and has flying. Both of these cards are really great as they're going to give Tuvasa some evasion, which is something that we really need to get in that commander damage and kill our opponents. Next up, we have Snake Umbra. It's 2 and a green for an enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has whenever this creature deals damage to an opponent, you may draw a card. It also has totem armor, which is really great to protect your creature from damage. Unquestioned Authority is 2 and a white for an enchant creature. When Unquestioned Authority enters the battlefield, draw a card. Enchanted creature has protection from creatures. This is another great way of giving Tuvasa and your other creatures evasion so that they can get in unblocked and deal their damage to your opponent. Then we have Unflinching Courage. It's 1 a green and a white for an enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and has trample and lifelink. And then the last aura that we have in this deck is Sage's Reverie. It's 3 and a white for an enchant creature. When Sage's Reverie enters the battlefield, draw a card for each aura you control that's attached to a creature. That by itself is extremely powerful. You can draw a ton of cards with Sage's Reverie. And then it also gives you the ability that enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each aura you control that's attached to a creature. This makes your creatures really big if you put this onto your Tuvasa. Next up, let's go over some of the utility cards that we included into this deck. So first up, we have Destiny Spinner. It's 1 and a green for an enchantment creature. Creature and enchantment spells you control can't be countered, and then you can pay 3 and a green. Target land you control becomes an XX elemental creature with trample and haste until end of turn, where X is the number of enchantments you control. It's still a land. This is a very powerful card, especially at an uncommon. It's going to make sure that all of your creatures and enchantments you play enter the battlefield. We can also use her ability to turn our lands into big creatures since we'll have a lot of enchantments on the battlefield. Next up, we have Eutropia the Twice Favored. It's 1 a green and a blue for a legendary creature that has Constellation. Whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. That creature gains flying until end of turn. This is going to pump up your creatures whenever you play an enchantment spell, and it's also going to give them flying. It's going to give them a little bit of evasion. You'll be able to get in with your creatures on that turn that you play that enchantment. Nylea's Colossus is 6 and a green for an enchantment creature that has Constellation. Whenever Nylea's Colossus or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, double target creature's power and toughness until end of turn. This card is crazy with a Enchantress Voltron deck, as it's going to double your creature's power every time you play an enchantment spell. If you have Trample on Tuvasa and you double up its power and toughness, you're going to be able to get in for a ton of damage and potentially take out an opponent on the spot with this card. So next up, we have Wilderness Reclamation. It's 3 and a green for an enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, untap all lands you control. This is a great card that allows us to play a bunch of spells on our turn and then untap and have all of our mana available for all of the interaction that we have in this deck. Smothering Tithe is 3 and a white for an enchantment. Whenever an opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2. If the player doesn't, you create a colorless treasure artifact token with tap, sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color. Smothering Tide is such a powerful card to include in any white deck that can play it. It's always worth an inclusion and will give you a ton of mana ramp in your deck. Sigil of the Empty Throne is 3 white for an enchantment. Whenever you cast an enchantment spell, create a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying. This is almost always worth including if you're playing an enchantment deck, as you will get a lot of 4/4 flyers whenever you play an enchantment. So next up, we're going to talk about a couple of tutors that we put in this deck so we're able to find all of our powerful auras and enchantments. So first up, we have 3 Dreams. It's 4 and a white for a sorcery. Search your library for up to 3 aura cards with different names, reveal them, and put them into your hand, then shuffle your library. This is going to find you all of your best aura cards and put them right into your hand for the low cost of only 5 mana. And then Plea for Guidance is 5 and a white for a sorcery. Search your library for up to 2 enchantment cards, reveal them, and put them into your hand, then shuffle your library. The cool thing about this card is it's going to let you get any enchantment card, not just auras, and put them right into your hand. Next up, we have a card that's not really a tutor, but it does help us look at the top few cards of our library and find an enchantment card. And it's Crufix's Insight. It's 2 and a green for a sorcery. Reveal the top 6 cards of your library, put up to 3 enchantment cards from among them into your hand, and the rest of the revealed cards into your graveyard. This is a really great card. For only 3 mana, you'll be able to get up to 3 enchantment cards and put them right into your hand. And then we have Open the Armory. It's 1 and a white for a sorcery. Search your library for an aura or equipment card, reveal it and put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. This is one of the best cost-efficient ways of finding an aura and equipment card by not only CMC, but also by price as well. And then we have Eldamri's Call. It's a green and a white for an instant. Search your library for a creature card, reveal that card, and put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. I really like Eldamri's Call because it is an instant. You can play it at your opponent's end step and then search for any creature and then play it on your turn. It's really a great card. Next up, let's talk about a couple of cards that help us make copies of some of our powerful enchantments that we have in this deck. So first up, we have Estrid's Invocation. It's 2 and a blue for an enchantment. You may have Estrid's Invocation enter the battlefield as a copy of any enchantment you control, except it gains at the beginning of your upkeep, you may exile this enchantment. If you do, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. Estrid's Invocation allows you to copy any enchantment that you control. You can also blink this card at the beginning of your upkeep if you play a better enchantment or an enchantment that you'd rather copy, and make Estrid's Invocation a copy of that card as well. This is a really powerful card in this deck, allowing us to copy any enchantment that we control. And then Mirror Maid is very similar. It's 1 blue for an enchantment. You may have Mirror Maid enter the battlefield as a copy of any artifact or enchantment on the battlefield. The great thing about Mirror Maid is that it will copy any artifact or enchantment on the battlefield, not just your stuff, but your opponent's stuff too. So if your opponents have something like a Soul Ring and you really want to get that mana ramp, you can play your Mirror Maid and turn it into a Soul Ring if you'd like. Since we are playing a Voltron strategy that relies heavily on auras, if one of our opponents goes to remove our creatures, we'll lose all of our auras. So we do want some ways of getting those auras back onto the battlefield and back onto our creatures. So first up, we have Crystal Chimes. It's 3 colorless for an artifact. You can pay 3 and tap it, sacrifice Crystal Chimes. Return all enchantment cards from your graveyard to your hand. So this is a really nice way of getting all those enchantment cards back into your hand so that you can replay them onto your creatures. Then we have Open the Vaults. It's 4 white for a sorcery. Return all artifact and enchantment cards from all graveyards to the battlefield under their owner's control. And then it says auras with nothing to enchant remain in graveyards. So you do want to make sure that you have creatures on the battlefield when you play this so that you can get your auras back onto your creatures. One thing to note with this card is it will work for all of your opponent's artifacts and enchantments as well. So you want to play this at a time where it's not going to really damage you. Next up, we have Retether. It's 3 and a white for a sorcery. Return each aura card from your graveyard to play. Only creatures can be enchanted this way. Aura cards that can't enchant a creature in play remain in your graveyard. So again, you do want to have creatures on the battlefield that you're able to enchant when you play this spell. Next up, let's talk about the combo that we include in this deck. And this is a combo that is a commander deck tech that we recently came out with, and it features Siona, Captain of the Pyleas. It's 1, a green and a white for a legendary creature. When Siona enters the battlefield, look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may reveal an aura card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. And then whenever an aura you control becomes attached to a creature you control, create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. Now this card in our deck by itself is just a really great card, as it's going to help us find aura cards, and it's also going to give us some additional value when we attach those auras onto creatures we control by giving us 1/1 creatures. But Siona does combo with a card called Shielded by Faith. It's 1 white for an enchant creature. Enchanted creature has indestructible, and whenever a creature enters the battlefield, you may attach Shielded by Faith to that creature. So what you're going to do with this card is you're going to have Siona on the battlefield, and you're going to play your Shielded by Faith and enchant your Siona. When Siona sees that you're attaching an aura to her, she's going to make a 1/1 white creature, and then Shielded by Faith is going to trigger and see that a new creature entered the battlefield and then attach itself to that creature, and then Siona's going to make another 1/1 white creature, and then this is just an infinite loop where you're going to get infinite 1/1 soldier tokens onto the battlefield. Now, in order to win the game on the spot with this combo, you do need a way of giving your creatures haste with something like a Crashing Drawbridge is a great example. We didn't put those cards in this deck as we did already make a deck tech around this combo. We did just include it as a way of getting a bunch of tokens onto the battlefield. Next up, we're going to quickly go over the mana base of this deck. So first up, we have 3 temples: Temple of Plenty, Temple of Enlightenment, and Temple of Mystery. They all enter the battlefield tap, and when they enter, you get to scry 1, and they all are dual lands that are going to tap for 2 different colors of mana. While these do enter the battlefield tapped, and that is a downside, you do get to scry 1 off of it, which does make up for it. Next up, we have Canopy Vista and Prairie Stream. They're both going to enter the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands, and they both tap for 2 colors of mana. And then Sunpetal Grove is a land that enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a forest or a plains, and then you can tap to add a green or a white to your mana pool. Yavimaya Coast is a land that you can tap to add a colorless to your mana pool, or you can tap it to add a green or a blue to your mana pool. Yavimaya Coast deals 1 damage to you. Since we are playing 3 colors in this deck, we do want as many dual lands as we can get, especially the cheaper ones that we can put into our deck. Next up, we have Rogue's Passage. It's one of our utility lands, and it taps to add a colorless to your mana pool, and you can pay 4 and tap it. Target creature can't be blocked this turn. If you have a Tuvasa that's suited up with a bunch of auras and you have a bunch of enchantments on the battlefield, you can give it unblockable and get in for a ton of damage with your commander. Hall of Heliod's Generosity is a legendary land that you can tap to add a colorless to your mana pool, or you can pay 1 and a white and tap it. Put target enchantment card from your graveyard on top of your library. This is a great card in this deck, as we will be able to get back a lot of our enchantments that we may lose over the course of the game to our opponent's removal spells that they have, and we do want some ways of recurring those auras back. Next up, we have 3 lands that are going to help us tap for all 3 colors of our commander's color identity. So next we have Command Tower. Tap it to add 1 mana of any color in your commander's color identity. Seaside Citadel enters the battlefield tapped, and you can tap it to add Bant to your mana pool. And then Exotic Orchard lets you tap it to add 1 mana of any color a land an opponent controls could produce. And more often than not, this is going to tap for all of your colors of mana, as we are playing a 4-player game, but there are rare situations where it won't. And then for basics, we have 9 forests, 8 plains, and 6 islands. There is a heavy emphasis on green, especially early on, as a lot of our early drops are green, so we want to get down our forests early. Thank you so much for watching this Budget Deck Tech today. If you have any suggestions for some of the picks in this deck, or agree with or disagree with some of the choices, let us know in the comments down below. If you like this video, consider subscribing to our YouTube channel if you haven't already, and check us out on Patreon over at patreon.com/BudgetEDH. There's a lot of different tiers for rewards over on Patreon. See you guys next time.